Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind adjust the theme, crossing new frontiers to conquer today's challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, St. Augustine.
Back in the 1980s, 25,000 supercomputer scientists had registered accounts on supercomputers across the United States. I had none. I applied for supercomputer accounts. The accounts were approved, but they were immediately revoked when the administrators discovered that I was black and African. The fastest supercomputer in the world costs more than the annual budget of each of the 40 poorest nations in the world. For that reason, the fastest supercomputer in the world is a very closely guarded technology. In Japan, a non-Japanese is not allowed to browse through the operating manual of the fastest supercomputer in Japan. In China, a non-Chinese is not allowed to browse through the operating manual of the fastest supercomputer in China. In the 1980s, vector supercomputer scientists mocked me and made fun of my discovery of practical parallel processing. Today, parallel processing is the vital technology that underpins every supercomputer. And those supercomputer scientists that mocked me and made fun of me are using the new supercomputer they once ridiculed. Back in the 1980s, 25,000 supercomputer scientists were programming vector supercomputers. I took the opposite direction, called parallel processing, that was then ridiculed as a huge waste of time. That was how I discovered how to parallel process grand challenge problems and how to solve them across a new global network of 65,536 tightly coupled commodity off-the-shelf processors that outline and define a new internet. That invention made the news headlines in 1989. My parallel processing experiment that I executed across my new internet, that was a new global network of 65,536 tightly coupled processors, was the first time a scientific discoverer of sub-Saharan African ancestry and that was born in Africa was assured priority by the Western media and credited for discovering practical parallel processing and for discovering it as the vital technology that will underpin every supercomputer and as the invention that changed the way we think about extreme scale computing, specifically the way we think about the supercomputer. And it was the first time a United States president assured priority and did so in a televised White House speech, and did so for an invention of an African-born scientist. It was the first time an African scientific discoverer was included in United States Core Knowledge Series. It was the United States, not Nigeria, that chose to study my invention of the practical parallel supercomputer and study it in its schools. Back in Africa, postage stamps honored white scientists such as Galileo, Isaac Newton, and Albert Einstein that were not born in Africa. I was the first sub-Saharan African-born inventor to be honored on postage stamps. Back in the 1970s, I was unknown and I wasn't hungry for fame. I wasn't among the first to promote my discovery of practical parallel processing to the wider audience. The Computer Society of the IEEE was the first to champion my discovery of practical parallel processing. The IEEE stands for the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. The IEEE is the world's largest technical society. The Computer Society of the IEEE recognized my discovery of practical parallel processing and did so by giving me the highest award in the field of supercomputing. The Computer Society of the IEEE issued a press release that described my discovery, and that was released in late 1989. The highest recognition that I received is when young students ran to my son to tell him that they were writing their school reports on his father. The highest recognition that a scientist can get is for a 12-year-old to tell him that he wrote a school report on his contribution to science. Another high recognition is to be called a father of an everyday technology, such as the father of the internet, or to be recognized as the patriarch of a profession, or to be on postage stamps and banknotes, or to receive a field's highest prize. Most importantly, for an inventor to be immortalized and studied in schools requires that his or her invention be useful, concrete, and tangible, and be in the living room or classroom of each student. Parallel processing physically transformed my global network of 65,536 processors to a different state or thing, namely a new supercomputer that is also a new internet. The supercomputers of today are different from the supercomputers of yesteryears, and different in the following way. The supercomputers of yesteryears solved only one problem at a time or in sequence, while the supercomputers of today solve millions of problems at once or in parallel. Back in 1989, I was in the news headlines for discovering that the once impossible is in fact possible. Namely, I discovered how to divide the toughest problems arising in physics, calculus, and algebra, and how to chop them into millions of smaller problems that could be solved in a one problem to one processor corresponded manner and solved across as many processors. I was also in the news headlines for discovering how to solve those smaller problems across as many commodity off-the-shelf processors that were identical to each other and that were equal distances apart from each other and that shared nothing between each other. Each of those processors operated its own operating system. Parallel processing, or doing many things at once, is the new supercomputer technology that I discovered on the 4th of July 1989 that is used to construct the modern supercomputer and the fastest computer, and that can be used to construct them from an ensemble of the slowest processors in the world. That discovery of practical parallel processing has rich and fertile consequences and is my signature contribution to the development of the computer, as well as the reason Philip Emeagwali is the subject of school reports. The computer is the quintessential human invention. It is the very symbol of genius and inspiration. Inventing the supercomputer is about turning science fiction to non-fiction, and doing so during the 67 years onward of February 1, 1922. The 4th of July, 1989, is the date that history decided that the supercomputer that is powered by parallel processing was invented, and the date darkness was turned into light. Historically, the most ignored inventors are those that were black and of African ancestry. The most memorable and the most negative thing that happened to me back in the 1980s was that research scientists who did not contribute to my research on parallel supercomputing and who fought against my having access to the vector supercomputer and who sabotaged my research while I was conducting it on parallel processing began to blackmail me and began to demand that they receive credit for contributions to the invention of the parallel supercomputer that they did not make, and to be given credit for my discovery of how to solve real-world problems and solve them by parallel processing them across millions of processors that were tightly coupled to each other and that shared nothing between each other, with each processor operating its own operating system. They claimed to know as much as I did about parallel processing, but yet none could deliver a public lecture on how they discovered practical parallel processing. That demand for unearned credit was an epiphany, because the visible side of scientists taking credit for what they did not invent and could not invent is that they could not give a lecture on their alleged invention or even discuss parallel processing without constantly reading from borrowed notes. Even though there are countless articles and videos of me giving most of the lectures on the subject of parallel supercomputer, some people still wanted to give the credit to white men such as Seymour Cray and Gene Amdahl, who did not invent the technology but instead mocked parallel processing as a huge waste of everybody's time. It is on record that both Seymour Cray and Gene Amdahl fought against the acceptance of the parallel supercomputer. This example of transferring the credit for my invention of practical parallel processing to Seymour Cray, that only invented the now obsolete vector supercomputer, was an example of the black tax that each black inventor paid to white non-inventors and pay to get any job promotion or scientific recognition. Parallel processing, the vital technology that makes every supercomputer super, was first published as a science fiction story back on February 1, 1922. 67 years later, and at 8:15 in the morning of the 4th of July, 1989, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States, I upgraded parallel processing from science fiction to non-fiction. I remember that date because it was the US Independence Day. My contribution to the development of the supercomputer is this: I upgraded parallel processing from fiction to non-fiction, and I did so when I parallel processed across a new internet, that is a new global network of 65,536 lowest processors in the world. And I did so when I recorded the world's fastest supercomputer speeds. 67 years earlier, my invention of practical parallel processing that occurred across a new internet, that is a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors, was published on February 1, 1922, but published as a science fiction story. That science fiction was the story of how 64,000 human computers could be employed to numerically solve the discretized initial boundary value problem of mathematical physics that encodes some laws of physics and that govern the weather above the surface of the earth. What is Philip Emeagwali famous for? I was in the news headlines because I was the first person to discover how to employ a new internet, that is a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors, and use them to forecast in inverted commas the weather below the surface of the earth. It was for that 1989 contribution to the development of the computer that I won the top prize in the field of supercomputing. My experimental discovery of practical parallel processing was highlighted in the June 20, 1990 issue of the Wall Street Journal. Practical parallel processing is the supercomputer invention that I am famous for, and is the invention in school reports titled Philip Emeagwali Computer. Being recognized by or being accessible to a potential audience of 1 million children is rarer than being recognized by 1 million scientists. It's like the difference between being known in popular culture and merely being known amongst computer scientists. Thank you.
Insightful and brilliant lecture.